Hello, I'm Elizabeth Diana. I lead Deal's communications team. I am genuinely excited to be kicking off what I think will be a very lively discussion around the future of global payroll, what the current challenges are, and more importantly, what the opportunities hold. Some very quick context on the state of global payroll. Deal recently commissioned a study with Forrester. We surveyed over 300 payroll decision makers across North America, EMEA, and APAC. And there were three main takeaways that I want to share with you all before we get into the panel. The first is that there are too many tools and too many vendors. So on average, decision makers use 5+ different tools to manage their global payroll systems, which is a lot. Other key issues that they cited had to do with hidden costs, limited reporting, and compliance problems. And the third main takeaway is that fragmented global payroll has a real impact on employee experience and retention. So nearly half of those surveyed said that payroll issues were actually affecting the consistency of their team's work experiences across geographies and their ability to retain top talent. So clearly, there's an opportunity for a more global, unified payroll solution. Let's hear more from our esteemed panel of experts. I'm going to kick it over to HR and Payroll Authority Anita Leddink, who is founder of HR Tech Radar, to moderate the discussion. So I will let Anita join, and I'll let her take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Elizabeth. And just for the audience members who want to read the Forrester study, I think it's available for download on the Deal website. So just go to the resources, and there you find a link to download this report, and I can assure you it's worth a read. So we've been talking about global payroll for probably about 2 decades when I first joined the payroll industry. But we've always lacked the technology to truly develop or establish a global payroll. And that meant that while it looked like a global payroll at the surface through the user interface, behind the scenes, there was a lot going on. So a lot of integration and conversion to ensure that all the data was compared as apples to apples. Fortunately, new technologies came to the market that allowed us to completely redesign global payroll from the ground up. And as a close observer of young companies in the HR and payroll space, I have seen the results come to market every single day. About 5 years ago, I wrote about the fact that payroll was ripe for disruption. And I'm so pleased to see the progress that we have made since then. It's good for business, it's good for employees, and it's also good for payroll professionals. So it's good for business because it is much easier now to pay people in different parts of the world while being compliant and having great data insights. It's good for employees because these modern solutions provide a better user experience and put the employee front and center. And it's good for the payroll professional because it means a more streamlined process, less time spent on data entry, compliant results, and most importantly, I think, fewer spreadsheets flying around. And so today I want to discuss with experts what it actually means to bring your payroll together at the global level. And I do that with 3 very experienced guests on the topic. Lindsay Ross, CHRO from Bitpanda, Pete Tiliakos, analyst and advisor at 360 Insights, and Bruce van Wyk, formerly the CEO of PaySpace, and they have just become part of Deal. So welcome, and please introduce yourselves to the audience. Lindsay, can I start with you, please?
Sure. And I'm gonna caveat because my voice is going. Just to warn everybody, I feel great. It's just, I don't know. Okay, so as Anita said, I am Lindsay. I am the CHRO at Bitpanda. We are a fintech company. Think everything from digital assets to crypto to everything in between. So based here in Vienna, where I am currently, although I'm normally in Amsterdam.
Thank you. Over to you, Pete.
Yeah, thank you. Excited to be here. Pete Tiliakos, I'm a longtime industry analyst, former practitioner, and leader that grew up in the HR outsourcing world and shared services space. So yeah, just I'm with you, right? I spent a lot of time working very closely with and advising many of the solutions that are being proliferated. And it's so exciting, right, to see where we've come to where we are, and excited to get into it with you guys today.
All right. And Bruce.
Yeah, Anita, thanks very much. Hello to everybody. Afternoon coming to you from South Africa. As Anita said, Bruce and Vake, one of the co-founders of PaySpace. We have been framework and architecting global payroll IT systems for over 22 years. So looking forward to a good discussion, to Anita's point, on the whole reality of global payroll from a tech and services perspective.
Thank you. And so let's dive right in, because the title of the webinar obviously is Can Payroll Be Truly Global? And that might imply that it isn't global currently. And so my first question is, does global payroll exist? And if not, what would it take to get us there? And Lindsay, I'm going to start with the customer's point of view. So why don't you kick in?
Oh, okay. I can say, does it exist? Probably not totally yet, would be my initial response. I think we're making some pretty bold moves to get there. And when we talk about the challenges or why it's not there or what is the reality today, I think for most folks in this space, it's really, we have a lot of different providers that claim to be global, but it requires a lot of local expertise. So you often end up with that middleman on the ground. And why is that? Because you have local tax, you have local regulations, you have local bank payment requirements and all sorts of different things. So there's a whole sort of element around that that makes it really challenging across the world to make it truly unified and global. In addition to this, you have things like different reporting mechanisms. You have all sorts of things that make it chunky and hard and complicated. Now, from a tech perspective, I'm not going to go in and tell you what I think needs to be done, because I'm going to leave it to the experts. But what I will say is, in order to make it truly global, I think we got to think a little bit bold. And I think that's kind of what we're here to talk about and see how we can do that.
All right. And I'll come back to you after we've spoken to the experts. So Pete, from an industry point of view, what would your answer be?
Yeah, look, I think the Lindsay really said it well. I mean, I think that depending upon how you define global payroll, right, which is part of the conundrum here, I guess, is yeah, it is possible, and there's plenty of examples of where it's being done. I think it's important to understand where we've come from, right? I mean, to Lindsay's point, payroll was never really built and meant to be global, right? It was always, and to be honest, it's hyper local. But global organizations need a centralized, harmonized viewpoint of all of that. They need certainly a harmonized experience and all the great things that you would want from a single platform, but it didn't entirely exist, right? We had so many local solutions built from the bottom up, never really a top down, to bring it all together. And so from that, I think you were seeing a lot of organizations operating in exactly that same fashion. And to your point, in the last, probably 6 to 10 years, we've seen this accelerate extremely because of cloud. It's really fundamentally cloud technology that has enabled the opportunity for these local solutions to come together to form and or be built into a global solution. So there's a lot of great stuff out there, a lot of exciting things out there. And the great news is, I don't think there's any one way to solve this. A lot of different avenues, and also no one size fits all, right? I think every organization is snowflake-like, they're different, and they need unique solutions. And I think that's what's really exciting about cloud, about extensibility, about APIs, and all the things that are bringing it together. So.
Right. So we've heard from the customer, who is a great analyst, industry point of view. And now I'm giving it to Bruce to tell us from a platform perspective. What do you think? How would you answer the question?
Yeah, Anita, so look, I think it's an intriguing question, because the question is, has it existed? It's a yes or no answer for me. No, from a tech systems perspective. Yes, from a service and people and reporting perspective, really why we've seen aggregation tools come about. But the critical one is, can it exist? And that answer is a definitive yes. But I think what's more important about that is when and how. So and that's where we really come in, as Pete says. I mean, what is really cool is, for people that have been there, like Lindsay, actually experiencing the challenges of why it hasn't existed before, and there's good reason for that, right? Return on investment for vendors has been a big question around the long tail side of it. I think that the price points of EOR make it much more feasible, much more, wanting to go after it. But then, to what Pete was saying there, you need to have the right architecture and right platforms to deliver it technologically. And that's the big area of getting it right. So I think, I would always caution around cloud washing, which is, what looks like a cloud situation versus true cloud native. I think that's going to be a big differentiator. And what Lindsay was saying there, to be bold, so it's all about disruption and actually, wanting to see the change. We're going after it because it is possible and it is now being done. So it's an exciting time, right? And I also think that it's been accelerated because of the fact that COVID really fast-tracked what was coming anyway, which is not only enterprise business requires this, you now have SME business that does need to employ talent around the globe, and they need to get those people paid and have the compliance there. So there's a push from all angles, which makes it even more exciting. So that's my view on that.
Thank you. And it's actually a nice bridge into what I was going to ask Lindsay, because Lindsay, if I'm correct, Bitpanda is growing as wheat, but it's not a large enterprise in the sense that you have tens of thousands of employees. So you're more in the space that Bruce just mentioned, but you do have employees in different parts of the world. And so what does good look like today from your perspective as the customer?
I think I would always leverage two perspectives. So as the user of the payroll tool and the system and the process, I think for us, what do we want? We would want something that is simple, that is easy to access, that is uniform in reporting, that gives me the right data information, right? I think from an employee perspective, this is different because actually as the people leader, that's the thing I care about ultimately. And what do I want? I want a single source access point. I don't want to have to go through different channels and tools to log into this clunky old school system, right? So it needs to integrate. It needs to be accessible 24/7, single sign-on for please, stuff like this, modern. And again, I think what we've seen out there is there's a lot of resistance to step into areas of, if we break into different markets, it's really, okay, what do I need? And is there different tax regulations or things we need to consider? Different social securities, what is it? And oftentimes you get pushed around to different providers or different service levels or whatever it is. And so when you talk about what good looks like, it's that single point of access to somebody to be able to provide us that information and who's not afraid to give that guidance, right? And that ultimately, not only from the employer side is fantastic, but again, from the employee's perspective, they actually get the answers and they get it fast. It's the speed that matters.
I can totally understand that. And Bruce, from a payroll build perspective, because maybe not everyone here on the call knows what Payspace is or what you do. So maybe you can tell a little bit about that and then answer the question from a payroll builder perspective.
Yeah, Anita. So look, I think Lindsay's hit the nail on the head there, around all the various factors of it. It's ease of use, on the employee self-service or manager self-service side is access to information, typically something that's, been lacking in the industry for 30 years plus, real-time information, that uniformity. So from a architectural perspective, the key here is really about being able to do that quickly, and you can only do that through configuration, right? So typically that's not something that the end users are going to see and experience, but if you don't do it that way, when it comes to speed of keeping up with compliance changes, which is happening all the time and at a fast pace, you're going to lag there. Lindsay is referring there to, needing to know what has changed, how has it changed. That needs to be addressed by having that built into the system. There shouldn't be a requirement anymore for a payroll user to have to know the legislation and which field to tick, and therefore, is it compliant? It should be compliant, and you're only presenting the information that's relevant and applicable. So those are typically the moving parts, and so that's the way we've architected to deliver on that, which is taking away, the focus on engineering teams having to scale and rather putting the power in the hands to be able to configure you know, when you're going to new countries, adjusting to new legislation. I mean, one of the big pillars that as a moving part for localization is reporting, as Lindsay says, right? It's in specific format, you know, and you've got to deliver it like that with the right information. So from a vendor perspective, it's about using tool sets that are going to allow us to do that quickly, which is what we do. So we have tools to interpret those formats, for instance. It gives us the template in the exact required format, and then we're just mapping the fields accordingly. So traditionally you would have, you know, reporting teams that are developing, you know, hardcore to get that done. So yeah, and critically, as Lindsay says, a single platform for that, you know, that has the calc, that has the accessible information all on it for the various levels, employee self-service, manager, you know, administrators. And again, that's all built in. So if you're not, you know, if you're not in that space, I'd suggest you're still going to struggle to not get to that modernized way of doing it. And again, that came around because of the advent of cloud, which is great.
Yeah, you know, just to add on to something, Lindsay, you said the word speed a little while ago. I think that's something that is coming through in the agility request of payroll now, right? And in order to be speedy, you're going to have agility, and that comes from your infrastructure, your people, your process, your tech. So I think you know, organizations, particularly as they scale, especially as they go outside their home country, they're looking for more agility, right? More resiliency, more flex in their payroll solution to be able to ebb with them as they grow, as they divest. And that's not going to happen if you're sitting it on top of your organization on top of an outdated solution. So incredibly, incredibly important. I think value enabler that payroll is delivering now is org agility.
Thank you. So when Elizabeth introduced the webinar, she was referring to Forrester research. And one of the outcomes of the Forrester research was that participants mentioned that they have 5 tools or 5 systems to manage payroll on average. And so, Lindsay, I'm going to ask you first, and I will not ask for a specific number, but when you look back at what you had at Bipanda before, was that 5 systems? Was that a little bit more, maybe?
Oh, I would say it's a little more.
It's a little more. You don't have to call out a number. But Pete, why do payroll professionals have so many systems? What is behind that?
Yeah, I actually was going to say, I think that number might be a little low. Either we're doing a lot of good work and we're getting more people consolidated, or maybe the folks we talked to didn't have that much. But I mean, you know as well as I do, right? I've studied the space for years, been on the side of deals where you've seen, you know, tens of systems and vendors and providers, you know, 30, 40, 50, 60 sometimes, depending upon the size of the company. And it's nebulous how they deal with that. And I think it comes back to that local problem, right? Is the fact that payroll is so local and the technology just hasn't been there. And one of the big problems, I think, is that a lot of organizations, I was just talking to an organization yesterday that's working on, you know, their offering in this space. And one of the things that I said is, you know, no one wakes up and says, hey, we're going to go and change our payroll. We're going to transform our payroll. Certainly they love that. They would love to do that. They need that, but no one's really starting there, right? It's normally a catalyst moment that is leading an organization to say, hey, we need to go solve for a region or hopefully the globe. And so I think that's, you know, all of that has created this perfect storm of, if it isn't broken, let's don't fix it. And let's just sort of, you know, do the best that we can. And the reality of it is that it's easier now than ever to be harmonizing and bringing things together. So not surprising to see that number. I think it's probably bigger depending upon who you talk to. But let's be honest, like, we're dealing with that even at the consumer level and employee level in our, you know, in business, right? I mean, there's something like a 15 to 17 app average per employee around the world, right? So, right, it's everywhere. And so that payroll is ripe for, like you said, differentiation, and it's time. It's absolutely capable in time. So exciting stuff to bring it all together.
Yeah, but I'm going back to Lindsay and ask one question about this, because after all, she is in the midst of this here. So if you have more than 5 systems to manage payroll, then how do you reconcile all that information? And for you as the CHRO of Bitpanda, what did you have to do to ensure that that information was correct?
I'm laughing because actually it goes back to what you had said at the first part, which is like Excel, Google Sheets. Like I mean, honestly, it's still like predominantly the default, right? Of course, there's other technologies and solutions and things you can introduce, but I think still right now, because you're getting information from so many different sources, right? And what works will go there. I think from our perspective, what unfortunately, because as we had a single provider, but actually it wasn't, with multiple different local real providers, when we got this type of information in, we would consolidate it. We would introduce that 4, 6, 8 I principle, making sure that things were working. But actually what the implication was is time. And so you have to build in a longer review period, right? And reconciliation period, which actually is painful, because then there's no ability in the business to be able to make adjustments. So that actually means if somebody has a salary increase or a bonus payment or anything that's coming through, expenses, if they don't make that exact cutoff at that exact period in time, which is actually quite far out, they don't get it until the next month. And so that is, from a speed perspective, a huge issue.
Yeah, and so not a great employee experience either.
It's not a great employee experience. And I think we forget, well, we don't forget, I think we're very well aware, but often people forget this is a big thing for folks.
Yeah.
Right. This is their livelihoods. This is ability to pay mortgages and child support and whatever else there is. Right. So it's not something you like to mess with so much.
Exactly. And so, Bruce, when you look at this from a platform perspective, how would you respond?
Yeah, Anita. So look, I mean, that's the exact problem that's existed, that Lindsay's put out there, which is it's all extremely manual, non-real time, the lack of access, turnaround cutoff times, payroll needs to be always on. You need to be able to literally get people paid on time when they need to, but you shouldn't be dictated by cutoff times, and typically that has been driven by the technology approach, in terms of how they do a payroll run. That concept in itself existed for a very long time. And traditionally there, you would also have systems going down to do these processes and produce the results. And as Lindsay says, for us, the focus was always in the wrong place, which wasn't delivering value to the employee. It was just trying to actually get the process done and through. So, typically changing where the calculation now happens at the beginning of the month and not at the end in that crunch time. So then there isn't any cutoff times. There is real time. There is changes that can take place. So what you typically saw there is that, yes, customers had to do their own things to get it right. Excel spreadsheets, I mean, if you bring in quite a complicated concept, which is like, we always generally talk about gross to nets, but what about net to grosses, right? Which is where you're trying to pay someone in another country now and meet what they were earning, but you've got different legislation, different taxation, social securities, etc. And that would iteratively be done on Excel spreadsheets to just try and figure out what is the gross that needs to be in play for that net to result, right? So automating all of that, and that really comes down to then I think it's a bit of both, which is you've also got to, from a feature perspective, be able to cater for that complexity, to deliver it so that you're getting away from all the manual intervention. And ultimately what people did was really try to consolidate on reporting level, because that's all they really could do, right? And that's when we saw the advent of aggregators as such, bringing a global tool together to kind of bring it all onto one view. But when things are manual behind the scenes, there's big issues with regards to risk on, accuracy of data, and where did they get it from? And is it real time? Is it latest, greatest? So that's where we ended up. And all of that should disappear when you're in a single source of truth and on one platform that is actually doing all the calculations across the globe for you, because it's consistent.
Yeah, and like we just mentioned with Pete, replacing or ripping out these types of systems, well, you typically need an event for that, because if it runs, and doing something to a payroll engine is always a little risky. So Pete, when you find a client in this situation, so having systems for various countries, contemplating to go to a global model because of better reporting, better user experience, what do you advise them?
Yeah, well, I think the reality of is, well, what I always advise folks is first, look for the thing that you're headed, where you're headed, right? To support where you're headed, not where you are. One of the key things I think we often sometimes see are firms will kind of storm off to do global payroll, transformation, but they don't necessarily have an end game. They're just sort of buying technology maybe and shifting things around. So that's not necessarily the right way to go about it. So first, it's making sure they have a strategy. But second, I think the beauty of extensibility in cloud now says, look, you don't necessarily have to rip and replace. You also don't necessarily have to throw away existing investments, right? Maybe you're good at a region. Maybe you have a solution that's working well and you've made an investment. You have to maybe retain and carry that investment through to its life cycle. I think that's where the integration can help you, right? And you can certainly now, more than ever, the flexibility in the solutions that are out there, being able to land and expand, right? Maybe today it's 1 or 2 countries and a small long tail population, but maybe tomorrow it's a larger long tail set or a bigger group of populations. So I think there's just a lot of flexibility that is available. So it's really about looking at where you are, where you're trying to get to, what you're trying to accomplish, and then looking at what your strengths and weaknesses are and utilizing those solutions to help you bring everything to the state that you're looking for, but also supplement your strengths and gaps. That'd be my advice. Yeah.
No, I think it's really good to ask clients to think about 3 years, maybe 5 years out. What's your strategy?
Yeah.
Sort of what is your burning issue today is important too, but where you want to head is probably even more important. And Bruce, from a pace-based perspective, I can imagine that you are involved in a lot of client conversations as well. So what would your advice be?
Yeah, look, I think Pete's got it right there. I think, the premise though needs to be this, that if a client is still thinking about cloud, I think that's a problem. I mean, you've got to transition to the cloud as soon as possible. Then transitioning using those integration options that Pete is highlighting there. But ultimately that's it, and that's where the cloud washing comes into play is, just because ultimately you want to know that you're not just replacing what you had on premise with a cloud-based solution that's cloud washed. So that's the first part I'd highlight. The second then is it doesn't necessarily, to Pete's point, and I agree with him, there have to be a lift and shift. We're seeing in certain markets, so like in Brazil, for instance, there is a hesitancy from customers to move because there's a reliance on taking, for instance, 5 years of historical data over, right? And that then is, how do they get that off their systems? That's the next thing. But what we've actually done, there's a first to market where we're actually now tapping into the legislation by eSocial where that information has been reported. So they have an advanced, system where the information sitting there, and we're actually collecting it from the authorities, the historical information, to do that shift across. So all of a sudden you're making that path a lot easier, as an example. In Africa, where there are vendors that don't have a payroll engine, they have HR. So we do then integrations already out the box. And that'll also facilitate, that the speed to getting a migration like that done is a lot less risky and stressful. And puts them into a comfort zone that makes sense. And then, like Pete says, so look, I think the criticality is APIs make that integration possible. So if it's driven by legacy, people tend to struggle. And that's where you want to see is, are you using and can you utilize API technology to make sure that when you are integrating, it's talking seamlessly and in real time. So those are some of the pointers I'd give out on that.
Thank you. And it's interesting how you explain that the path to global payroll can be a little bit different depending on where in the world you are and what kind of local requirements there are around your next payroll and your ability to move to a new payroll. For instance, that example of Brazil and the 5-year 5-year data that you need to move forward. But I also want to switch a little bit away from the systems angle and talk about the talent angle. And Lindsay has spoken a couple of times already about the employee experience, because what we saw coming out of the pandemic is also a completely different view on talent. Suddenly we realized that talent didn't necessarily have to be local for all of the vacancies that we had, but that we could also tap into a global talent supply. And when you do that, then you actually need to rethink the way that you are paying people, because suddenly you get the question, do you want to be responsible for that employee sitting by themselves somewhere in a remote country? Or do you want to do something different? And then what? So, Pete, can you talk a little bit about this global talent, global payroll angle and how that has changed?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it actually, just to maybe step it back a little bit, I think the expectations of payroll are changing. There'll always be compliance and risk management, right? Risk avoidance, certainly will become and should be a center of expertise for that. They should have, continue to do the great, hopefully strategic advisory to their business to help them understand, data and insights to navigate these compliance features. But I think increasingly what we're going to be looking to payroll for, we've already talked about the org agility part of that, and a lot of that is going to be in their data and their speed to being able to flex and handle what the organization is putting it through, or trying to do and where they're trying to head. But I also think that there is a growing need for payroll to be an enabler to accessing talent anywhere, right? I was thinking about, if you think back to the pandemic, right? There were a lot of employers that didn't actually know where their employees were. Just here in the US, we had a number of folks that were tooling around in RVs and kind of, maybe living this digital nomad life from state to state, but employers didn't necessarily have nexus in all of those states for those folks to even be in those states working. So that created problems. And the same thing happens with work from anywhere, especially when you're hiring talent in other places and maybe not familiar with those local rules, because they are very different from one country to the next. It's not enough to expect that, what works in the US or maybe in Canada or anywhere else is going to work someplace else. So I think what you're seeing is that payroll is getting more and more involved in the compliance conversation, deeper than just paychecks and reports, and having to enable that. And without that, that's where the organization, I think, will lose that speed and agility. So they need payroll to be in a position to stay ahead of where they're headed next. That means proactive engagement and giving them the opportunity to help the organization prepare and guide and make the right decisions. So I think there's a new sort of strategic advisor viewpoint that payroll should be a lens that they should be put through. And they're the types of things I think they're going to be asked of them, I should say.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to switch to Lindsay to ask her to provide the client perspective, because Lindsay, you have talent across the globe, right?
Yeah, I think actually, Pete, the way that you said that, the payroll needs to be an enabler. That's like the best phrase I've heard in a long time, because I think when you start expanding into different jurisdictions, why are you expanding into different jurisdictions, right? There's also the business opportunity, but as you guys were mentioning, post-COVID, it's actually because that's where the talent is. Why? They don't have to relocate anymore, right? So now you've got to go into these different countries from the ground and you say, okay, how am I going to do that? And usually you're nervous to go into a new country because that means you have to set up a new payroll. And that's a painful process, right? And so it's actually, instead of being an enabler, it's a hindrance. And I think where we're seeing that shift is, in all fairness, with companies like Deel. Why? You can go in now to say, hey, I think there's some really good talent. I have a couple options in how I'm going to employ them. I can do it through an EOR, AKA through Deel, and have them take over all the compliance, the regulatory, everything around it. They run. Fantastic. As that continues to scale and I hire more and more folks in that local jurisdiction, I can then set up my own entity. And when that happens, then you also have a partner in crime that can give you that guidance on how to do it, and then take over the full payroll from that perspective. And again, it really ties into what both Pete and Bruce have been talking about, is that innate hesitation, that fear, that like, oh my gosh, am I compliant or not? That must have knowledge. You don't have to have necessarily in-house yourself. You have a trusted partner, and that's the game changer. And so really, if we go back to what is the future of payroll, that.
Thank you. That was really clear. And payroll as an enabler. Bruce, anything you want to add to that before I move on to the last question?
Yeah, anytime. Look, I think what Lindsay's saying is paramount. You need to have the flex between the three, because that's the ultimate solution, right? Because it talks to scale and complexity, and that's as follows. When you're starting out, EOR is excellent and it ticks all the boxes, takes away all the stress. You're compliant. So everything is working fantastically. Then you might have a requirement to do like managed services, you know, when you're a little bit bigger, but maybe don't have a dedicated team, or you don't have the capacity in your shared service center. So that's when a managed service or global payroll, you know, as deal terms that offering. But the criticality then is that what happens when you get to scale where you're outside of that, and that's self-service payroll, right, which is SaaS. And that's why the positioning now is perfect, to be able to talk to a customer where you can offer any one of the three in isolation in jurisdictions, or all of it in a particular country or across the board, and being able to go up or down and across. But again, in a single platform, that's the key, because now all of a sudden, you know, you have that total comfort in knowing that the compliance is built in, the feature set is rich, and because SaaS is normally a lot more complex than EOR would typically require. So that's the differentiator, is being able to do all three and offer all three. And that's why, you know, even from a price point perspective, it makes it a lot more. That's where the ROI now sits, and why it has actually been unlocked. So yeah, I couldn't agree more on that, the three together or standalone becomes absolutely critical to do that, to actually just be able to do it.
Thank you. So I see some questions coming in, and we'll get to those in a couple of minutes. But I also want to bring up one last topic, because we're 40 minutes in and we have not mentioned the word AI once, which I think is wonderful. But we're going to talk about it in the last question, because it is coming to payroll. And so, Pete, do you want to start and tell us where you see the biggest need or the biggest opportunity for AI and payroll?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's super exciting, right? There's a lot of nebulousness to this. It's nascent, it's early. I think it's there's a lot of fear and a lot of misunderstanding for it. But I think AI is a tremendous machine learning as well, a tremendous opportunity for payroll, right? I mean, just the fact that Lindsay was talking about, you know, in a non sort of integrated and connected single state, you're going to be doing a lot of manual work, right? A lot of the ticking and tying that goes on in payroll historically. That shouldn't happen anymore, right? We're moving far beyond now, sort of that, you know, automation age now into more of an augmentation age. So what I think you're really going to see from it is, most impactfully, we're already seeing the payroll inquiries being managed, right? More help for people to get better insights and better decision making. That's already here, pretty standard in most of the solutions. We're also now, I think where I get really excited is data movement, right? You think about like a mid-quarter conversion or something like that, or just any, you know, moving multiple systems to one system. There's a lot of different reports, different, you know, outputs that come to you as a leader. And when you're working to get that done, that's where AI can help, right? AI can help shuttle that in and out very quickly in almost any unstructured format. And that's beautiful, right? Because now you're looking at just anomalies and you're not doing all this sort of manual scrubbing. You can use, you know, it's being used certainly to scrub data at the point of source and keep more of a self-healing capability to data across systems. So that's beautiful. And then I think lastly, compliance, right? Just, I mean, think about United States, 16,000, I think it is, entities and locals or something here. You go beyond the United States, there's thousands in every country. So you're talking, you know, if you're in 10, 12 countries, you have a real mess on your hands. I think that's where we're going to see, you know, generative AI and AI be able to surface that information to practitioners and leaders and say, hey, this is something you need to act on. Systems need to be updated. Tables need to be adjusted. Maybe you might need to change your process a little bit. There's things that have to happen in all of that. So for me, I think it's the experience of the user, the augmentation. I think it's the compliance, and I think it's the data movement is where we're going to see, you know, probably the most immediate and impactful piece of this.
Yeah, and so Bruce, from a platform perspective, are the things that Pete just mentioned the things that you are working on, or are there other functionalities that you're looking at as well?
Yeah, Nita. So look, I agree with Pete there. You know, typically the easier parts are, you know, variance on gross to nets. You know, why is there variance? What is the reasoning behind that to pick it up? So you need AI to be able to go through the actual calculation to pick that up, and that can get really complex. You know, is it sitting within the pension side of the calc or the medical, you know, whatever it may be. So the front runner is certainly compliance. But it's going to get interesting there, in my opinion, because interpretation of legislation in payroll is one of the biggest challenges, right? So you can have information picked up by AI and putting it down, but we see examples in developing countries where the execution of the interpretation for one country can be three different things. There's the interpretation of the law, there's the execution on the ground, and then there's the execution of that per state, for instance, right? So we've still got to be quite careful in getting the information. So that's definitely going to have an impact in being able to thrash through it very quickly and put summarized versions to that for the forefront. But then it's really about making sure that the executable version of that is the right one, that the customer gets. So certainly agree that it's all sitting in compliance. From a trends area perspective, agree with Pete there, identifying those, putting it out. Managed services, in getting input in where it's repetitive, or can be interpreted or understood. So, seeing that and certainly using that. But I think for us, it's on the configuration side behind the scenes on the actual platforms where we're probably going to see more initial benefit. So typically that example I gave, on interpreting a legislative report and having AI generate that into a template where I don't need to actually go and code that anymore, and then just doing the mapping to that. So those are the examples. And I think as time goes on, time will tell, as to the effectiveness of which are the areas that we're going to mostly see it in. It's definitely there. It's being utilized and will grow. And yeah, training is probably another one, right? Training in payroll, that's building those in, but you've got to have the knowledge base. You've got to have it correct to then be able to have AI execute on that. So yeah, I agree that those are the core pillars.
Thank you. And we're almost ready for some Q&A. I see some questions come in, but if you have a question, put it in the chat and we'll make sure we'll pick it up. And while you are typing your questions, I'm going to ask our panelists one final question, and short answer, please, so that we have enough time for the audience questions. But 5 years from now, if we are organizing this webinar again, and we're talking about global payroll, what will we be talking about, Pete?
Yeah, well, look, I hope we're talking about more progress. I think we've got a lot of organizations that are behind. I think that there's not a digestion of this stuff fast enough, right? There's too many reactions versus proactive nature. So we've got to get more organizations transformed. And if we do, I think we're going to be talking about a very different expectation of payroll, right? I think you're going to be looking at them as a strategic value enabler, a COE that, again, is going to be a strategic advisor and helping the organization achieve its goals. And maintain compliance and stay out of trouble, right? I think that's going to be the key. It's only going to get more and more intense. And so, yeah, I hope we're talking about all the great things we've sort of touched on here. But I think it's going to take an acceleration of adoption for these modern solutions and practices. And I want to just add something else that we need to be very careful of. We just did a study on this. I have some great research on what it means, how organizations can, and executives specifically, can bring this out of their payroll teams, and what happens when you do. And one of the things that concerned me most in that, we interviewed, I think, something like 700 plus or so practitioners and professionals around the world, 28 countries, 5 continents. And what made me most worried was 49% of them said they have more than 20 years experience. The next layer down is about, I think it was about another 30+% of folks that are in the 11 to 19 years. So about half, more than half, excuse me, a considerable number, maybe just a third are in that younger sort of phase of their career, which means we're going to lose a lot of very experienced and very skilled folks. And I think some of that is going to be attributed to people working in environments where they're laboring when there's no need at massive risk. So I think we've got to have a good focus of accelerating our attention on payroll and creating more of a adoption here for it to get it forward.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also a little bit of an awareness issue, right? Because I had this post on LinkedIn last week. I don't know if you saw it, but it's when I was 10 years old, I wanted to be a payroll professional, but of course not. No kid wants to be a payroll professional. So that was a little bit of a nice exchange with the audience. But Lindsay, in 5 years from now, what would you be saying on this webinar? Any idea? Or what would you want to be saying on this webinar?
I was gonna say, I don't know how long, so I'll leave it to those guys to answer that. But I think, again, I'm just gonna reiterate, I think the future is that payroll itself, because it's got the tools, the mechanisms, the compliance, everything that everybody is building, which is awesome, really becomes that enabling function that creates genuine, incredible experiences for the employees, and that puts that experience at the center of everything they do. That would be the future for me.
That is great. And so I'm going to give Bruce the final word because he's the one that's going to realize that from a platform perspective, right?
Yeah, Anita. So look, the words for me is embrace change first and foremost. Is going to get us to where Lindsay's saying, and then for me, it's going to be the excitement about talking, how we did do this, which is to get all of those countries onto a single platform at record time to deliver on that unbelievable experience. And I think what Peter's highlighted there is. It is a worry, but at the same time, I think it's going to be a breath, or passing the baton, which is the younger generation to take that baton of where payroll came from, and to actually get it delivered to the modernized, sexy way that payroll can be. And that's what I want to be talking about, because it's happening, and now it's just about looking back in the rearview mirror and talking about how cool it was to have done it the way we did it.
Yeah, we got to find a way to get them to come work, enter their careers at Payroll, right? There's a lot of opportunity.
Our responsibility to make payroll fun.
Yeah.
Bruce, Pete, Lindsay, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your ideas about payroll, global payroll, and the future of payroll. I know that you're all on LinkedIn, so if people want to reach out, ask a question, please connect with us on LinkedIn, and we'll help you. And now it's time for the audience questions. And I'm going to start with the first one that came in. And Pete, that one is for you.
Yeah.
So can you explain how global payroll systems can be tailored to specific industries or sectors?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I think that at the core, regardless of the country, payroll is about 80 to 90% the same from organization to organization. What is generally different are going to be minor sector challenges and often self-inflicted things that maybe the organization has held on to, or in some cases, collective bargaining agreements and union requirements that drive that. What I find in my experience is most organizations are having to solve a lot of that in the build to gross, which is often in the time system. It's generally doing a lot of the heavy lift. However, what I think, and I think Bruce would certainly have a great opinion here, is the way the organizations these new solutions are being built. They're built with incredible flexibility to be able to accommodate small, unique nuances to various different clients. So there is a very flexible nature, both structurally in the technology to connect to other things, but as well as being able to meet your unique needs. And I think now more than ever, you're not having to, because of microservices and other architectures, you're not having to go through these large sort of configurations to make changes. You're able to make small, edits to fields and build things very quickly and not, disrupt your cloud structure. So I think it's a little bit of a mix, right? And that, just depends on the environment and the country, that sort of thing.
So especially when it comes to industries and sectors,
Yeah.
we're subject to collective labor agreements. And
Oh, yeah.
of course, new payroll has to accommodate for that.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
a question that came in, Lindsay, I'm going to ask you to answer this. Can you share any success stories of organizations that have effectively implemented a global payroll system? And you don't have to talk about other organizations, obviously, but maybe talk a little bit about Bitpanda and where you are at.
Nice. I was going to say, because I don't know anyone.
No.
I think
We have you.
we're going through that journey now, right? So we are working with Deel. We made the transition to Deel this year. And we were actually on a quote and unquote global provider before, which was anything but a global provider. It was a middleman to all these different local providers, right? So you really do feel as the end user and the customer, like you were sold a giant lemon. And I think with Deel right now, at least what we're going through is super cool. So we've gone, I think we've transitioned now 6 countries already. And what I love most and why this is successful is because it's been probably a very easy process. So to put this into context, I had received a letter from our local provider in the Netherlands, previous to Deel, that said, hey, by the way, and this was 7 days before we were supposed to be paid in the Netherlands in January. By the way, we're not paying you anymore. We're not going to process your payment, your payroll.
Okay.
And we had 7 people up to pay. We had 7 days. So let alone the legal and breach and contract and all that stuff that we had to deal with. I literally picked up the phone and spoke to the Deel team, and they're like, cool, let's figure this out. So we actually went live with an entire country in 7 days. So the speed is there, I think, which is really cool. The ability to kind of push boundaries and take some risks with us is really cool. And we've been very clear with our employee base on this. Hey, we're building this on the fly, like come with us, right? And so they've been wonderful that way. And I think you can see that sort of mentality continuing to roll out in all the different countries, and the process keeps getting better and better and better. But I think more just from the usability perspective, what makes it so cool, one single point of contact.
Got it. And when I talk to payroll clients, I hear that one a lot. You do not want to end up talking to all these local providers if you're going with a global payroll vendor. You want this one single point of contact, obviously. Thank you. And before people think that you're only moving 7 employees, you have moved much more than that by now, right? Yeah. So, final question that came in, I think. So, Bruce, I think I'm going to ask you this question. How do geopolitical changes and economic shifts influence global payroll operations? And I understand that this is maybe a little bit of a difficult question.
Yeah, that is quite an interesting one. So I need to look at, I think in the current state, that would actually impact quite heavily depending on the nature of that geopolitical situation, right? If we're talking about war and whatnot, well, if you had on the ground operations executing with a localized system that's on premise, you're going to have challenges getting your people paid. So that's why, being on a cloud system accessible from anywhere, where they are always on teams, we're actually able to step in and execute on that on your behalf. If that does unfortunately transpire, that's going to be big. And that's why for me, you shouldn't be in that position. You should be moving away from that to go, listen, it's about accessing my information, having it available real time, knowing that it's there, to be able to execute on that. So, the shifts that I see going forward then are what we've really been talking about, which is that you're not going to really be exposed to that position as much the more that these countries get consolidated onto that one single platform, which means that that's a lot more comforted, and then I think that, because of that option, people can then actually physically move if need be, and go work from somewhere else, which makes it possible where maybe they were restricted in that. So that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, and actually, when the war in Ukraine started, I was working with a company that was based in Ukraine. And so I experienced firsthand what happens if you suddenly have to move all your people to different parts of the world, simply because an unexpected, well, in this case, a geopolitical change happened from an HR perspective. Pete, I saw that you need to add something to this.
Yeah, I would add 2 things to this. I would say that that's a great example, right? Russia, Ukraine. I saw a lot of angst with that going on when that happened. And I think this is where having a partner really comes into play, right? Same with COVID, right? We saw a lot better receptive response by US companies in particular in getting funding from the government when they had a partner, and that partner was able to help them go through the process, navigate it, that sort of thing. Same thing here, right? If you've got a great partner, they're watching this constantly. They're bringing this to you. They're going to help you make a good decision because it's their business, right? So I think that's where having a partner is going to be key. And here's one more thing I want to leave you with. In 2024, there will be 64 major entities around the world going to the polls, right? That represents 50% of the world's population. We can absolutely expect that come 2025 and plus, right? There's going to be a pop, I think, in change. And even with people who stay in office, there will be initiatives that will come out. So this will trickle down, no doubt, to the workforce and the employers. So now I think more than ever, having partners is probably key. And that's another way that I think that the partners bring a lot of value in orbiting you and making sure that you're ahead of these things.
Thank you. And so I see one more question come in, and I'm going to take that as the final question before we wrap it up. And Pete, I think this one is between you and me, actually, because of our background. So what is the ideal model or way to have a payroll function of 80+ delivered? Does the concept of payroll hubs work in reality?
I would say that there is no ideal model. It's what's ideal for you. So go back to my original comment about strategy, vision, where you're headed, what you need to solve for, and where you are right now in terms of what you can and can't do. No doubt 80 of those countries can't move all at once. There's probably a phasing to that. So I think it's also about looking at that vision, looking at that strategy, also looking at what your HR strategy is as well, from a technology, from a shared service perspective. 80+ countries, if I'm reading that right, that might sound to me like a larger organization. You might have a shared service opportunity there, and that can sometimes become, I would say a lot of the bigger companies I've seen in recent really big RFPs are starting to look at more regionalized sort of solutions. So there's another way to go about it. So without a lot of detail, I'd say there's a few things you kind of surface level want to start with.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, I do have experience in payroll hubs, running payroll hubs, but I would say from a multi-country perspective, start thinking in hub and spoke models.
Yeah.
You need to have a proximity close to where the legislation is made, simply because you need to understand that very well at the local level. There's always interpretations, and that is very hard to do if you are not on the ground in a country. It can be done, but I would still think in hub and spoke models. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for being on the call, for asking us questions, for listening to the panel conversation. Lindsay, Bruce, Pete, thank you so much for your participation today. To the audience, don't forget to download the Forrester report on the deal side. I can promise you it is interesting. And follow Deal on LinkedIn, on other social media for future updates. Thank you.